first witness today, I will be reading one more business record certification into the record.
Thank you.
Good morning. This is State's Exhibit 9A and 9B, medical records for Maureen Argie. Certification of medical records. To whom it may concern. I, Kristen Gutterson, custodian of the following medical records of Maureen Argie, 773-722, hereby certify that the attached records are true and authentic copies of the medical record prepared in the usual course of business at Elliott Hospital, and they were prepared by the employees of said institution on the dates endorsed thereon per the requirements of New Hampshire law. Dates of service, 3/12/2008 to 9/20/2019, signed by Kristen Gutterson, Health Information Management from the Elliott Health System. At this point, Your Honor, the state calls Dr. Pamela Stamegna.
Could you raise your hand, please? Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to provide this court and jury shall be the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury?
I do.
Thank you. Please be seated. And if you could get yourself situated nearer to that microphone, and if you could give us your full name for the record and spell your last name.
Pamela Stamegna, S-T-A-M-E-G-N-A.
Thank you. And I remind you that since we're all wearing masks, it's a little bit harder to hear, so if you could project your voice a little bit more than you'd normally. Sure. Counsel.
Thank you. Good morning, doctor.
Good morning.
Can you please tell the jury what you do for work?
I'm currently a scientific writer at the University of Massachusetts Medical School.
And what do you do there?
I work on bringing new COVID-19 tests to market.
Okay, and prior to your work there, what was your former employment?
I was a primary care physician at Elliott Primary Care in Londonderry.
What were your responsibilities in that role?
I would see both adults and children for routine and urgent care visits.
Through your role as a primary care physician at the Elliott Primary Care, did you meet Maureen Argie?
Yes, I did.
And was that Elliott Primary Care that you worked at, where was that located?
It was in Londonderry, New Hampshire.
How did you come to meet Maureen Argie?
I met her at a routine physical in 2017, and also she accompanied her children on their visits.
Prior to testifying today, did you review Maureen Argie's entire medical record from the Elliott Hospital providers?
Yes, I did.
And these records spanned from 2008 through 2019?
Correct.
I'd like to direct your attention to April 18th, 2017. The entries in her medical record reflect that you had an appointment with Ms. Argie on that date?
That's correct.
Your Honor, maybe you vote.
You sure? Yes. The objection is sustained.
Thank you, doctor. We're just going to continue. So what was the purpose of your visit with Maureen Argie on that date?
It was a routine physical.
And when you met with the patient for an annual routine physical, Would routine procedure include just reviewing medical history?
That's correct.
And was that done with Ms. Argie?
It was.
Did Ms. Argie have any history of surgeries?
She had a history of a tooth extraction.
Did you have some conversation with Ms. Argie during your visit with her on that date?
Yes, we did.
And can you explain what that conversation involved?
Part of a routine physical is screening for depression. It's done at every adult physical in the office. And she had refused to answer the questions to that screening, so we further discussed why she refused to answer those questions.
And what was her response to that?
She did not want to answer the screening questions because she felt that she was already depressed.
Did she give an explanation for feeling depressed?
She thought that it was mainly or primarily due to some marital issues.
And did you document that conversation in Ms. Argie's medical chart?
I did.
And you testified that when performing annual physicals, conducting a depression screening is routine? I'm sorry, you have to answer yes or no.
Oh, sure. Yes.
And based on your experience, would patients sometimes decline screenings?
Yes, they would.
Based on your review of her medical record, do you recall Ms. Argie having any history of depression?
No, she did not.
Do you recall Ms. Argie having a prior report of depression?
I do not recall a prior report of depression.
According to Ms. Argie's medical records, her last scheduled medical visit was October 17th, 2017, correct?
That's correct.
And what was the purpose of that visit?
That was to administer a tetanus injection after she had cut herself.
Thank you. If I may just have one moment, Your Honor.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Any cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor, it's going to take me a moment. I'm going through my review of the records quickly, and I will,
Of course.
thank you. Good morning, Doctor. I just want to bring your attention to a visit in 2015. You did not see Maureen Argie for every physical visit she had with the Elliott.
That's correct.
But when you prepare for a visit with yourself with her, you review the past records.
That's correct.
And would reviewing a past records refresh your recollection as to whether Ms. Argie had expressed experience of depression?
Yes.
I'm going to bring to your attention notes from June 9, 2015, pages 1797 through 1801. Could you take a look at these yourself, read them to yourself, and when you're done, pass them back to me? Reviewing those records, does it refresh your recollection as to whether Ms. Argie had a history of depression?
It does.
And what does the records indicate?
So in the review of systems, under psychiatric, that provider wrote depression related to marriage.
Thank you. And so that was back in 2015.
That's correct.
And just going to give you records from 1797 to 1815 and ask if Ms. Argie visited the clinic or the Elliott in 2016.
No, she did not.
Thanks for your time.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor, thank you.
And may this witness be excused by both sides?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You can step down, you can stay or leave as you choose. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Honor, the state calls William Gagnon to the stand.
So would you raise your right hand, please? Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to provide this court and jury shall be the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury?
I swear.
Thank you. Please be seated. And once you're comfortable in that chair and close enough to the microphone, if you could share your full name with our court reporter and spell your last name.
Sure. My name is William M. Gagnon.
Good morning, Mr. Gagnon.
Good morning.
So just as the judge indicated, if you could just kind of sit closely and speak up so that everybody in the courtroom will be able to hear you.
All right.
All right, thank you very much. Are you familiar with William Argie?
I am.
Do you see him in the courtroom here today?
I do.
Can you please identify him and describe an article of clothing he's wearing?
The gentleman in the black suit.
Thank you. Your Honor, would the record please reflect the witness has identified the defendant?
It will.
Thank you. Mr. Gagnon, how are you familiar with the defendant?
We used to play poker together.
About how long have you known him for?
I would estimate about 4.5, 5 years.
Okay. Do you remember what the defendant told you that he did for work?
Yes, he told me he was a physician's assistant.
Do you remember if he told you anything he did previously to that?
Yes, he told me originally he was a medical doctor.
And based on your conversations with the defendant, was the defendant married?
Yes,
Did he have kids?
I believe he had 2 children.
I'm going to direct your attention to 2018 and to 2019. Where would you interact primarily with the defendant?
At the poker room in Manchester, New Hampshire.
And when you were at the poker room in Manchester, New Hampshire, would you be gambling with the defendant?
Yes, I would.
Would you gamble often with him during that time frame?
Yes,
Approximately how often?
I would estimate 1 to 3 times a week.
And what games did you see the defendant playing when he was gambling?
What years?
What games would he play?
Oh, we played Texas Hold'em.
From your time gambling with the defendant, who else did you see him with regularly?
Jamie Timbers, Vincent Muth, Peter McGann.
Okay.
It was pretty much the same crew that played together.
And based on your observations, do you recall when the defendant was gambling, did he typically win, lose, or break even?
Typically lost.
From your observations, do you recall whether the defendant ever borrowed money from people at the casino?
Yes,
Did the defendant ever borrow money from you?
yes,
Did the defendant borrow money from you more than once?
yes.
About how much did you lend him?
Generally 500.
So generally, when you would lend him money, you would give him 500 at a time?
Yes,
Did the defendant discuss repaying the money to you back?
yes. Usually it was he would pay me right back.
Would there be sometimes where he wouldn't pay you right back?
There was one time when it took him a little longer than normal to pay me back. I would say about 3 weeks.
Is the amount of $500 significant in gambling?
Only in the sense that it's the maximum buy-in for that particular game, which is called 2-5 Texas Hold'em.
Can you just generally explain what 2-5 Texas Hold'em is for the jury?
Sure, it's a game where 2-5 represents, the 2 represents the small blind, which is the first bet. The 5 represents the large blind, and that ensures that there's money in the pot so that there's something to win. And you can buy into 2-5 Texas Hold'em from 200 to 500. 500 was the maximum then. It has since changed, but back then it was 500.
Okay. And when the defendant would borrow that $500 from you or others, do you recall whether he would win, lose, or break even, generally?
Well, since he was borrowing, he was losing.
Do you remember about how much the defendant would lose during a gambling session?
I think the max I've ever seen was like around 2,000.
Okay. Do you recall ever hearing the defendant talk about his wife?
Yes, yes.
What were some of the things you remember hearing the defendant say?
Mostly that she was displeased with him gambling. Sometimes it'd just be normal talk about family and wife, but I would say the biggest thing was that she was displeased with his gambling.
Do you remember the defendant talking about anything else generally in regard to his wife?
Generally, just typical stuff, you know.
Do you recall whether the defendant talked to you about if he was having issues with his wife?
Yeah, I think the gambling was creating issues on the home front.
Do you remember hearing the defendant speak about her just once or frequently?
It generally came up like maybe every other time, you know.
Do you remember having a conversation with the defendant about his professional plans?
Yes.
Can you please tell the jury about that conversation?
At one point, he told me he was considering going to North Carolina to pursue a law degree, which I thought was a dramatic change from being a physician's assistant, but sometimes people change careers.
So do you recall about when you had that conversation with the defendant saying that he wanted to move to North Carolina to pursue a law degree?
If I remember correctly, it was sometime early in 2019.
When the defendant spoke to you about moving to North Carolina, do you recall what the defendant told you in regard to his wife and his kids?
Yes, I had asked him if his wife and family were going with him right away, and he said no. And then I said, will they be coming down later? And he said no.
If I may just have one moment, Your Honor. I have no further questions. Thank you.
Any cross-examination?
Good morning.
When you said that you've known Bill for 4 to 5 years, you're talking from today's date?
Yes,
So back in 2019, you just known him for a couple of years?
that's correct.
Just to describe the gambling room, this is a place where there's no windows?
Did you say no windows?
Yeah,
There are windows in other parts of the building,
but where
but
you
in the
play
room we
poker
were in
games,
at the time, there were no windows.
right, and the lights on all the time,
Yeah,
and
yes,
drinks are served at the table?
yes, they are.
And the idea is to keep playing the game,
Right,
because some people win a lot doing it that way, and the poker room makes money that way.
correct.
And when you play a game like Texas Hold'em, when the players are playing against each other, the poker room takes a percentage of what you put in.
Yes,
That's how it makes money.
right,
So the more games you guys play, the more the poker room makes.
correct.
And you said you play at a table with Jamie Timbus?
Yes,
Is Jamie Timbus a good poker player?
yes,
He owned the joint.
yes, he does.
And he would round up the players to play with.
I don't know if I used roundup. People would show up, but we tried to get the same guys at the same table, but I don't think you rounded them up. But
Okay. but was he in charge of assigning players to tables, or? do
No,
people-
the floor person would do that.
Okay, all right. And did it appear that Jamie and Mr. Argie were good friends?
Yes,
And did you ever observe Mr. Jamie Timbers text Mr. Argie to find out where he was for the game?
he might have, I'm not aware of that. Several of us would text Jamie back and forth, depending on what day it was, what time.
So if he was expecting you and you couldn't come, you would text him?
Right.
And as far as what people talked about in the, at poker games, it was, pretty much what happened at the table stayed at the table?
That's pretty much true, yes.
Kind of like the locker room talk?
Yes,
And Bill liked to vent sometimes?
sure,
He liked to dream sometimes?
sure,
That's not unusual?
right.
So when you watched Bill play poker, you would watch him lose.
Yes.
And could you describe for the jury what his demeanor was like when he lost games?
I'd say very emotional,
Very emotional?
yeah. Everyone has a degree of how they play the game and emotion is a big part of the game. And emotion can cause you to lose.
Did you speak with the, let me, did you speak to an officer back on April 5th with Trooper Martineau?
I was interviewed at the poker room. I don't recall the gentleman's name.
Okay, and you recall that he had a recorder going while he was talking,
Yes, I did.
and he asked you questions,
Yes, he did.
and he asked you questions about Bill Argie,
Yes,
and you answered those questions as truthfully as possible,
yes,
and, because they were investigating homicide,
correct.
the death of Maureen Argie. So, at that time, didn't you tell him that when he lost it, he didn't seem too upset?
Can I have the page?
Oh, sorry, yes. 10, line 8 and 9. Does that sound like something you would say?
Yes.
And what would you mean by that?
Well, there's varying degrees. We have some people that are just horrendous losers and the kind of person they shouldn't, but would tip over a table. Not that that's happened, but that's the extreme. In Bill's case, I just felt he got emotional, which is normal.
Okay, so
When I
it
say
wasn't
upset,
out of the ordinary,
No,
and he would just keep on playing.
right.
Did you ever talk with him as to whether or not he had a gambling problem?
Talked to him about that he had a gambling problem?
Correct.
I don't think so.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have no questions, thank you.
And may this witness be excused by both sides?
Yes.
Sir, you can step down, you can stay or leave as you choose. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Your Honor, let me just have one moment before I call my next witness.
Sure.
Your Honor, the state calls Peter Floridia to the stand.
So if you could raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to provide this court and jury shall be the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury? I do. Thank you. Please be seated. And once you're comfortable and close enough to that microphone, if you could state your full name for our court reporter and then spell your last name for her.
Peter Floridia, Floridia.
And sir, I'll remind you, because we're all wearing masks, our voices don't project the same way. So if you could keep your voice up, project a little bit more so that everybody can hear you. Thank you.
Good morning, Mr. Floridia.
Good morning.
So I'm going to be asking you a few questions. We're just waiting for our, I think I accidentally closed the screen instead of opening it. Sorry about that. Okay, so Mr. Floridia, are you familiar with William Argie?
Yes, I am.
Do you see him here in the courtroom today?
Yes, I do.
Can you please identify him and describe an article of clothing?
He's sitting over there with a black suit.
Your Honor, would the record please reflect the witness has identified the defendant?
It will.
Thank you. So, Mr. Floridia, how are you familiar with the defendant?
I'm an acquaintance of his. 2018, I received a phone call from a mutual friend of ours, and she asked me if it would be okay if I would, that she could give him my phone number because he had a gambling problem, and at the time, and still am, I'm a member of Gamblers Anonymous.
Thank you for sharing that. And Mr. Floridia, I'm just going to ask you, just if you can keep your voice up, I just want to make sure that everybody can hear you, okay? Thank you.
You're welcome.
So who was that friend that asked you to share, if she could share your number?
Karen Waystack.
What is the defendant's connection to Karen Waystack?
I believe Karen and Bill's mom have been friends since childhood.
So I'm going to direct your attention to April 2019. About how long had you known the defendant around that time period?
Probably mid-2018 to that point.
Okay. So at some point, did you actually meet the defendant in person?
Yes, we met one time at Panera's before a meeting, a GA meeting in North Andover.
And when you say GA, you mean
Gamblers Anonymous, yes.
Thank you. And so after you met him at Panera, did he initially begin going to Gamblers Anonymous meetings?
Yes, he attended that evening, yes.
That evening. Did he maintain attendance at Gamblers Anonymous?
Very sporadic.
And was there a point where he stopped going altogether?
Yeah, there was a time that he hadn't shown up in quite a while.
About how often did he actually go to Gamblers Anonymous meetings?
If I had to guess, I think I'd probably say 5 times maybe.
5 times in the total time
Yeah.
you knew him?
Yeah.
Mhm. Even though he only attended 5 times from 2018 into 2019, did you still text him when he stopped going to those meetings?
Yes, on a daily basis. I send out a daily reflection to many Gamblers Anonymous members, Alcoholics Anonymous members, and I had him on my list, and I would send that out every day.
Would he respond to those daily reflections?
Not so much the daily reflections, but every once in a while, I would check in on him, see how he was doing.
So to those daily reflections, about how long were you sending him those daily reflections without him responding to those?
It was a long time.
Okay, so I'm going to direct your attention. Oops. Oh, I apologize. I'll just ask my counsel if you can click for me. So I'm now showing you State's Exhibit 42, which is a phone chart. I'm going to direct your attention right up here. Does this chart accurately reflect your phone number in the spring of 2019?
Yes.
And now, if the council can go to the next slide. Now, I'm showing you entries from State's Exhibit 43, there's a communication chart. And I'm going to direct your attention right up here to that front line, first line. Does that also reflect your phone number?
Yes, it does.
And that's your name listed right next to that phone number?
Yes, it is.
Okay. If I could have the next slide, please. So now I want to direct your attention to some text messages exchanged between you and the defendant on April 2nd, 2019. So first, did you allow the police to photograph text messages that you had with the defendant?
Yes, I did.
If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so again, I'm going to be directing your attention to April 2nd, 2019. And if we could have the next slide, please. So I'm directing your attention, as you can see up at the top, Tuesday, April 2nd, 11:05 a.m. Let's look starting up at the top for the contact. It says Billy Karen Waystacks, and then there's an F. It's kind of cut off. So can you just explain what that contact is for?
Yes, so I have so many people in my contact list that are in program that, so I put Billy in as Karen Waystack's friend. So if he would call, if I would, I would know who it was.
Okay. And for State's Exhibit 51, we're going to look at this text message, and who does it appear initiated this conversation?
Billy.
So I'm going to read the text messages, and then I'm going to have some questions for you. So this first text message reads, Peter, I know you're probably at work. Can we talk and touch base in the next day or two? I have a meeting in Methuen tonight until 8. Was going to try to make meeting in North Andover tonight, but not sure we'll make it. Bill. What time did you receive that text?
11:05, according to that screen.
And that's AM?
AM, yes.
Thank you. And when the defendant said he was going to try to make a meeting tonight in North Andover, from its context, did you know what he was referring to?
Yes, the gamblers not on this meeting.
If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so it looks like there's a response up at the top, and how does that read?
Okay, Billy?
And was that how you responded to the defendant?
Yes, I did.
All right, now directing your attention to the next time, Tuesday, April 2nd at 5:09 p.m. I'm going to read to you the green. So it says, I just got out of work, try and make, but if not, call me around 9:15. I'll be on my way home from the meeting. The response is okay. So who sent this text message in the green?
I did.
Okay, so you sent that message to the defendant,
Yes,
and he responded with okay.
correct.
If I could have the next slide, please. All right, so turning now to the next exchange on Tuesday, April 2nd, 9:38 p.m. The first text message reads, Peter, I didn't get out of meeting until 8:30 and just got home. No, it's late. Can we talk tomorrow? Did you send that or did you receive that?
I received that.
So you received that message from the defendant?
Correct.
And when he said, I didn't get out of meeting, from its context, what meeting was he talking
I'm
about?
assuming the work meeting that he had specified in the text before that.
And it looks like the response in green is NP, so is that your response?
Yes, no problem.
All right. And then the next response is great, talk with you then. Was that from the defendant?
Correct.
Followed by, in the green, okay. And was that from you?
Yes.
Did you go to the Gamblers Anonymous meeting on April 2nd?
Yes, I did.
Was the defendant there?
No, he was not.
The defendant asked you if you could speak tomorrow, correct? When he said, no, it's late, can we talk tomorrow?
Oh, yes, yes.
Did the defendant call you the next day, April 3rd, 2019?
No,
Did he text you on April 3rd, 2019?
no,
Did you ever speak with him on April 3rd, 2019?
I did not.
I have no further questions. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any cross-examination?
Good morning.
Ask you a few questions about addiction.
Mm-hmm,
Gambling addiction is like other addictions.
absolutely.
And one of the things on recovery from an addiction is the importance of going to meeting.
Absolutely.
And the reason for that, it reminds you how bad it was when you were in the midst of the addiction.
Correct?
It helps you avoid old thinking that kept you in the addiction,
Correct?
and it provides support for others.
Absolutely.
And one of the keys for treatment for addiction is that the addicted person initiates the treatment for him or herself,
Correct.
that they accept that they have a problem.
Correct.
Otherwise, it doesn't sink in.
Exactly.
So your role as a sponsor is sort of, when you see somebody struggling, is to say you're available,
Correct.
that you wait for them.
Excuse me?
You wait for them.
Correct.
To be ready. So that's why you send out I'm sorry, what do you call them, the messages.
The daily reflection. It's a
Daily
spiritual,
reflection.
it's a spiritual text.
And that's just a reminder to potential sponsee that you're available.
Correct.
And also to let them know that your line is always open, no judgment.
Correct.
So when somebody's in the throes of the addiction, it's compulsive. There's a compulsive aspect to the addiction.
Correct.
Sometimes it's somebody has to drink all the time or gamble all the time.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Or
Sometimes it's a binge thing. You do it sporadically, but when you do it, you really go all out.
Correct.
Addictions negatively affect relationships,
All aspects of life.
work,
Work.
and it can be physically harmful,
Correct.
like depression.
Absolutely.
And in terms of your relationship with Bill, you were at the he wasn't ready to commit.
Absolutely.
You met him in January of 2019. You went to Panera.
I'm not sure if that's when it was. I'd have to, it was sometime,
Okay, but it was at a Panera
it
restaurant.
was at Panera in North Andover, yes.
Okay, and you kept the door open for him.
Correct. We talked and, like I said,
And you saw him at a meeting in April 23. Is that correct? At the end of April?
possibly. I go to so many meetings, I don't
Okay.
recollect.
Do you recall saying that you saw him at the meeting and he looked incredibly depressed?
Yes,
And that is typical of somebody in recovery.
yes. Was that 2019, April 23rd?
Yes.
Yes, now I remember, yes.
At some point, did you receive a call from Bill Argie's wife?
I did.
And do you recall when you received that call?
I do not remember when I got a call from her.
And do you recall what her state of mind was at that time?
She was concerned, she said that she was concerned that Billy was at Chase's poker room in Salem, and she didn't know what to do. And I said to Maureen that I can't get involved between the two parties. What I suggested for her to do was go to Gagnon, which is a fellowship for family and friends of someone that's a compulsive gambler.
So it's a gambling version of Al-Anon?
Correct, yes.
If I may have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
Just briefly, Your Honor, if I may have one moment.
Sure.
I'm sorry.
Oh, I just said one moment.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Just a few more questions for you, Mr. Floridia.
Sure.
Mr. Floridia, are you a clinician or a physician?
No, I'm not.
So do you actually know whether the defendant had a diagnosable addiction as a doctor?
No, not at all.
And based on your experience, can people with addictions do desperate things?
Well, we have a line in one of our booklets that says imprisonment, insanity, or attempted suicide, or suicide.
So, based on your experience, can people with these addictions do desperate things?
Absolutely.
Like what? Like you mentioned, can you just repeat, like, what types of things, what type of desperate things have you experienced? Seen people experience?
Bank robbery, robbery, domestic, stealing from employers, 401ks, stealing from, the family, so many,
Yes.
different
And
things.
thank you. And people that are experience addictions, do they often neglect friends or family?
Absolutely,
And do they often hurt loved ones?
absolutely.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Any recross?
Yes, Your Honor. You were asked about a diagnosis of gambling addiction. Are there medical treatments for gambling?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
Rehabs.
And- Pardon me?
Rehabs,
Okay. And how many years have you been involved with gambling?
last month I celebrated 30 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So you've been exposed to a lot of gamblers.
I have.
And may Mr. Floridia be excused by both sides?
Yes, you can.
Okay. Attorney Nye, you're all set?
Yes.
Sir, you can step down, you can stay or leave as you choose. Thank you.
Your Honor.
State next calls Thomas Leccese.
Good morning, sir. Could you raise your right hand, please? Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to provide this court and jury shall be the truth under the pains and penalties of perjury? Thank you. Have a seat. And once you're comfortable in that chair and close enough to the microphone, if you could provide your full name to our court reporter and then spell your last name.
Yep. Thomas Leccese, Leccese.
And sir, let me just remind you, because we're all wearing masks, sometimes it's hard to hear people need to just project their voices a little bit more than they'd normally for us to all hear them, okay?
Gotcha.
Thank you.
And Judge, apologies and apologies to Mr. Leccese. Before we begin our examination, I would like to read a certification of records.
Sure.
Apologies. And this is State's Exhibit 3. And I, Thomas Leccese, on behalf of Chasers Poker Room, hereinafter Chasers being first duly sworn, say, I'm a keeper of the records for Chasers, a poker room and casino located in Salem, New Hampshire. As a keeper of the records, I am familiar with the business practices of Chasers with respect to its generation, collection, and maintenance of records pertaining to, among other activities, activities of patrons who sign into playing at Chasers through the use of Poker Atlas, an app that allows people to find and reserve spots in area poker rooms. In the regular course of its business, Chasers makes and keeps records pertaining to activity of patrons who use its facilities through the Poker Atlas app, which records contain such information, including the date and time when the patron has used the facility, as well as the particular game the patron is playing. The attached record is for patron activity on March 29th and 30th, 2019, for a patron identified as William Argie of 118 West Road in Londonderry, New Hampshire. The record includes the times when the listed patron used the facility at Chasers, as well as the particular games played. Such information was collected and recorded in the usual course of regularly conducted activity at Chasers, and was made by the regularly conducted activity as a regular practice. The information contained in the record was generated at the time of the purchase made, and was generated electronically and contemporaneously with the activities recorded. So, Mr. Leccese, I want to ask you questions about your role at Chasers. Back in the spring of 2019, were you employed at Chasers?
Yes, I was.
And what is Chasers?
Chasers is a charitable gaming facility in Salem, New Hampshire.
And what was your role at Chasers in the spring of 2019?
Director of Operations.
And for about how long had you held that role?
About a year.
And what were some of your responsibilities as Director of Operations?
Hiring, training, scheduling, little of everything.
Prior to working at Chasers, did you work at another gambling establishment called the Manchester Poker Room located on South Willow Street in Manchester?
Yes, I did.
And what job or jobs did you have there?
I was a floor manager there.
And what were some of your floor responsibilities as a floor manager?
Overseeing the operation, pulling rakes, cashing people out, little of everything.
And with respect to floor manager, I take it that's a person who's actually physically on the premises while the gambling is occurring?
Correct.
Did you also have prior work experience at other gaming establishments in New Hampshire over the years before 2011?
Yes.
I want to get back to Chasers. What kind of gambling activities are run at Chasers?
There's poker, blackjack, roulette, and then a couple different novelty games.
And reference was made from another witness about Texas Hold'em. The jurors probably know what Texas Hold'em is, but Texas Hold'em, that's a form of poker.
Yep.
And with respect to the gambling at Chasers and the other establishments where you worked at, in New Hampshire, was that for money?
Yes.
And if you can explain to the jurors who may not be familiar with legalized money gambling in New Hampshire, how that was possible.
It's just like it would be in any casino. Just a portion of the proceeds go to the charity that you're representing for the day. New Hampshire has certain limits that, what you can buy in for, and so you're just playing for money against other players.
So because it's part of the proceeds go to charity, it is legalized in New Hampshire at Chasers, the poker room, and other facilities that are licensed?
Correct.
Back in 2019, did Chasers have an ATM machine physically present inside?
Yes.
Do you know the defendant, William Argie?
Yes, I do.
And for the record, can you please identify him for us?
Right there.
For the record, you need to also describe him audibly for us.
There's a lot of people right there, so if you could be more specific, that's
The
all.
guy in the black suit all the way to the right.
Thank you. For the record, reflect that the witnesses identified the defendant.
It will, thank you.
Mr. Leccese, in 2019, for about how long had you known the defendant? Again, about.
About 8 years, 10 years.
And how did you come to meet and know the defendant?
From working at Manchester Poker Room.
Did you also see him at Chasers and the other poker establishments where you worked over the years in New Hampshire?
Yes.
From what you would see of the defendant at those various gambling establishments, Chasers and the poker room, for example, what gambling activities would he participate in?
Poker, Texas Hold'em.
I want to direct your attention specifically to the time period of March of 2019, the month before the defendant's wife's untimely death. You said that you were working at Chasers as Director of Operations.
Yes.
During this period, March of 2019, did you see the defendant at Chasers?
Yes.
And do you recall how frequently you would see the defendant at Chasers during this time period, which again was March 2019?
A couple times that week.
I want to show you entries on a communications chart for a cell phone number corresponding to the defendant, Mr. Argie. Shows on March 30th a call made at 11:56 a.m. to a number 603-912-4604. That 4604 number, you're familiar with that?
Yes.
And is that a number associated with Chasers?
Yes, it is.
And before, when I asked you about how frequently you would see the defendant that month, you said a couple of times that week, but I was referring to the entire month. Would you see him additionally to the week that we'll be referring to?
I don't really remember.
Do you remember talking with investigators in this case?
Yes.
And if you recall, the interview that you had with investigators was recorded?
Yes.
And is it fair to say that your memory was fresher then, a couple of years ago, than it is today?
Definitely.
Would reviewing a copy of that transcript of your recorded interview possibly refresh your recollection?
Yeah.
Counsel, it's page 5 of the transcript. So I'll ask you to read page 5 of the transcript as well as go on to page 6, and when you finish reviewing, if you could look up. Reviewing those pages of your transcript, does that refresh your recollection as to his activities that month then when you saw him
Yeah.
at Chasers?
Yeah.
And for the month, about how often would you see him?
A couple times a week.
And that would be for the week, for the month,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And in terms of the time period when you would see him, those couple of times a week, do you recall that as well?
Like how long he was there?
Yeah.
It was always different.
Are we talking minutes? Are we talking?
No, it would be hours, but, you know, the amount of hours is always different.
And what was the defendant doing at Chasers when you saw him that month of March of 2019?
Playing poker.
When you saw him at Chasers in March of 2019 playing poker, do you recall him saying whether or not he owed anyone money?
There was one person, yeah.
Now, I want to go over the record that I read into evidence. Can you see that from where you're sitting? It might be difficult.
For the most part, yeah. I kind of know what it is, so.
I'll actually give you the record. It might be easier for you to read from that. So this is State's Exhibit 3. It's titled Player Activity Report. And it's a player activity report for William Argie at 118 West Road, Londonderry, New Hampshire. From your role as Director of Operations, are you familiar with these player activity reports?
Yes.
And if you can explain to the jurors what a player activity report is.
The player activity report is how many So they do it in minutes and hours, but it's how long they spend at the table. And it only tracks when you swipe your card.
Which was going to be my next question. Does a
Yep.
player activity report record every time when an identified customer has been to Chasers in any given period?
Identified, yes. Yeah.
But you have to swipe in, right?
Yeah, you have to give your card to the dealer and they swipe you in.
So if you can explain that to the jurors. So if you have a player activity report, you have a physical card.
Yep, so you give them your ID at, when they first make you a card, then you get that card, and every time you sit down at the table, you give it to the dealer, they swipe you in, and that records the minutes played.
And you also have to swipe out at the end of a session in order
No.
to time out?
No, when you get up from your seat, the dealer will remove you from your seat. Like,
So these player activity reports only records the activity in which the card is swiped?
correct.
So for example, you can go to Chasers and not use your card and gamble, and that wouldn't show up on the player activity report?
Correct.
So I want to look at the data columns in this period, in this record, I'm sorry. And the far right, it says cash points. What does cash points refer to?
It's, so every, I think 200 points is $2. So
And
it's, at this time, you were earning 50 cents an hour. So for the 4 hours was played, he would earn $2.
So the cash points is based on the amount of time that somebody is playing, not on amount of winnings or losses,
Correct,
right?
yeah.
So there's no correlation in wins and losses with cash points.
Correct.
We have so here to session minutes and session hours, which are the next two columns
Mhm.
over from cash points. What do these two columns reflect?
How long he played at the table. So the minutes just convert to hours. It's just the same.
So for example, here at the top session, we have 240 inter-session minutes, so that's 240 minutes,
Correct.
which is 4 hours.
Yep.
So the next data column has game name. What does that data column represent?
The game that was played.
So here, if we can start from the bottom, it shows at the bottom $1 to $3 PLO. If you can just explain to the jurors what that refers to.
Yeah, so the $1 and $3 is the money you're responsible for putting up before you get your cards, and that is, there's a button that goes around the table, so everyone takes turn putting up that money. And then PLO means pot limit Omaha, which means you can only bet what's in the pot.
And these poker games, is it just 2 players sitting at a time?
No, it can be up to 8, or at this time it was up to 9 players.
So reading up the data column for a game name, after $1 to $3 PLO, it goes to $2 to $5 NLH. What is that?
Stands for no limit hold'em.
And with respect to the $2 to $5, again, what does that mean?
Small blind would be $2, big blind would be $5.
Okay. And again, these are all second nature to you, but when you say big blind, small blind, if you can break that down to...
Yeah, it's just money you're responsible for putting up before you get cards. So for everybody to enter the hand, they would have to put up $5. But there are 2 players that have to put up the amount of money before they get cards.
And every round of betting is the $5 for this? All right, 2 to 5?
No, well, you have to put in at least 5. The round of betting is no limit hold'em, so you can bet whatever you have in front of you. As opposed to pot limit, you can only bet what's in the pot at the time.
So after that initial payment of funds into the pot, I could theoretically put up $100 down in a bet?
Yep.
The last game on this data column for game name is $5 to $10 NLH, no limit hold'em. What's that mean?
Same thing, so small blind $5, big blind $10, and then NLH is no limit hold'em.
So the last data columns are open date and close date. What does that represent? Or what
Open date.
do those indicate?
Open date is when they swiped into the table, and then close date is when the dealer took them out of the table.
So the most recent date you have here, first we have March 29th of 2019, week before the defendant's wife's untimely death. how much time was the defendant at Chasers based on his player activity report?
For this week or for that day?
For March 29th.
4 hours.
And does it also represent that he was at Chasers Poker Room the next day, March 30th?
Yes.
And according to the defendant's player activity report, for how long was he at Chasers Poker Room on the 30th? About.
7.5 hours.
Thank you. One moment. No further questions. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Any cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. You've known, in 2019, you've known Mr. Argie for 8 to 10 years,
Yes.
and you knew him at the Manchester Poker Room,
Yes.
so you worked for Jamie Timbus.
Yes.
You were the director of operations there?
No, I was director of operations at Chasers.
What was your position at the Manchester Poker Room?
Floor manager.
And one of the things that the floor manager does, they organize the poker games.
Yep.
Okay. And Jamie Timbus would often be matched up with Mr. Argie.
What do you mean matched up? Like playing at
They
his
play
table?
games
Yes.
together.
Yep.
And you knew Bill to be a perennial loser.
Yes.
And Jamie Timbus was a pretty good player.
I didn't really keep track of who was good and who was not.
He was your boss,
Yes.
so he was there every day.
Yes.
And you saw that he liked playing poker.
Yes.
He was in business of playing poker.
Yes.
He was in business of making money in the poker room.
Yes.
And during the course of time that you knew him, you didn't know that he was married?
No, I did not.
You didn't know that he had kids?
I did not.
And are you still working at Chasers?
Yes.
And was there a time in March of, around the time that the prosecutor was talking about March 29th, March 30th, that you stayed in touch with Jamie Timbus?
In March? I'm sure I did, yes.
In fact, you told Jamie Timbus that Mr. Argie was playing at Chasers?
I don't remember.
Nothing further.
Anything further from the state?
No, thank you.
Okay. And so may this witness be excused by both sides?
Yes.
Okay, sir, you can step down, you can stay or leave as you choose.
Okay,
Thank
thank you.
you.
Your Honor, the next witness involves some different media, so I'd ask if you could take the morning break at this time.
Sure, I was just going to suggest that. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we're going to take a quick recess. As you know, as soon as you're ready, we'll try to come on back up here.
All right.
During this morning's session, before we had the jury come in, I forgot to address the issue of media, and so I had intended that we'd everybody else can have a seat. Feel free to sit down. To address that issue before when we had our morning recess, so I'll do that now. I have reflected on the issue of media coverage during the testimony of relative to the autopsy and the scene investigation. And I'm going to allow media to stay in the courtroom and live stream, other than they are not going to be allowed to present or live stream any of the exhibits that are discussed during any of the examinations. So if there's an automatic connection to the screen, that has to be dismantled during that portion of those witnesses' testimony. So that's my opinion at this point. I'm happy to hear from counsel if they'd like to address it any further.
No, just that we can coordinate with the cameraman about when those two witnesses will be testifying. And
Okay.
if we need a recess, we'll work the court for that.
Sure, thank you. And is there anything else that I can address with counsel?
Did you want to go first? No. We just wanted to talk about jury instructions, and we weren't sure if you wanted to do that now or if
We-
you wanted to do it later.
We can do a lunch and recess timeframe, okay? Anything from the defense that I can help with?
No, thank you.
Okay, great. Stretch your legs, use the restroom. We'll see you back here in a short while. Thank you.
All right.
Jennifer Jones, CAC.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no problem.
We are going to need the judge out before the jurors be called back in, whether it's now or later. That's the one. You can go about it.
I'll let her know.
No problem.